I think now we can credibly make the case, just like the AI community has credibly made the case, that Bitcoin does matter and will matter very soon to a lot of these strategic questions. That Bitcoin tends to do Bitcoin things. Going from a $2 trillion asset to a $20 trillion asset and reach parity with gold is not an implausible scenario in the time horizon of current politicians in the next 2 to 4 years. That single move, right, in the minds of politicians has all these cascading effects. It then magnifies in importance all of these other policy issues, protections for self-custody, the protections for open source software developers. But if Bitcoin does become like a global digital gold, then these will have massive implications to like which direction do we choose?
All right. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Policy Hour, a weekly podcast hosted by the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I'm your host, Zack Cohen, an associate with BPI, and I'm joined each week by my colleagues Matthew Pines, BPI's executive director, and Zack Shapiro, BPI's head of policy. We're now just 3 weeks out from the Bitcoin Policy Summit, June 25th here in Washington, D.C. Tickets are limited, and we expect to sell out. We're going to talk a little bit more about what you can expect there, but go ahead, grab your ticket today, visit btcpolicysummit.org, and we do have a 21% discount code for listeners of this podcast, so use code BTCPolicyHour21. Hines, what are we expecting at the Policy Summit? I know we've got some stuff to share.
Yes, we've got really an exciting lineup of executive branch officials in particular that I'm really interested to hear articulate a nuanced view of Bitcoin in particular. And, we've been rolling out some of those announcements. I think we'll have some more to come, but just some headliners, right? From my perspective, right? Again, we're fanboys of this space, right? So these names are celebrities in our mind, but it's important to sort of, foot stomp the significance of some of these folks that are coming to a Bitcoin specific event talking about policy inside of Washington, D.C. So we have the SEC Commissioner, Hester Pierce. She's wonderful. She's been, doing the rounds on a number of other events. I think she's a good spokesperson for kind of a different approach towards digital assets more generally. We also have Bo Hines and Tyler Williams, folks that have been on again, kind of stage talking about the administration's approach to digital assets and the upcoming kind of policy report that's due per the executive order later in July. Two individuals, though, that I think folks maybe are not paying attention to. They're a bit more kind of behind the scenes, but they'll be coming to speak at our event. Is Bo Hines, is Michael Hellis, who is the CIA deputy director. Now that's unusual, right? You don't normally have the deputy director of the CIA, speak at policy events, let alone a Bitcoin policy event. And I'll be doing a fireside chat with him for almost half an hour. And we're really going to, talk about where does Bitcoin fit into the administration's view of the geopolitical and economic strategic environment here. There's a lot that is changing in that environment, a lot of both U.S. policy shifts as well as adversary, reactions. And there's an intense competition underway across emerging technology and kind of the economic kind of battlefront. And Bitcoin is now emerging as a geopolitical asset in that context. And so I think I will be very interested, and I will be, trying to tease him out on these questions. I think that will be very, very revealing and very, strategically important to see how someone in position of national leadership inside our intelligence community that doesn't make policy, they advise policymakers on changes that are happening in the world and what might be the consequences or what might be the reactions around the world from U.S. Moves on different fronts. So I'm really interested to hear someone like him articulate a view about Bitcoin and digital assets in the strategic context. And then we'll have some other individuals coming from, again, kind of that strategic perspective. We haven't announced their names yet, but I think folks that will be increasingly important inside the White House and across the policy space. And then we're going to have, a really great lineup of U.S. senators and representatives: Cynthia Lummis, Tom Emmer, Alyssa Slotkin, Jim Justice, Marsha Blackburn, our good friend Nicholas Begich from Alaska, Warren Davidson, and a number of other congressmen that are looking to attend. And so, every year the Bitcoin Policy Summit has essentially doubled or tripled in terms of the size and the scale of its impact. And I think this year will be no different. So we're really looking forward to this being kind of a watershed moment, capping, I think, what has been a very decisive shift in at least the rhetoric and the policy orientation from the White House And I think we really want to focus on what does that mean down the line in terms of the policies that each, sort of arm and leg of the administrative machinery can move in a pro-Bitcoin direction, and how to do that in a way that maximizes the opportunity and minimizes the related risks associated with doing something novel, right? Doing something a bit ambitious here. And so we want to sort of chart the course, set the agenda, and bring all the right people to the table, folks maybe from non-traditional kind of spaces that don't normally talk about Bitcoin in a serious way. This is like the event to kind of pull all of those different threads together, generate at least a sense of consensus and a call to action, and also drive connections between folks in the government, folks in the policy space, folks that are technologists, policy experts, and sort of industry perspectives to really get like ground truth, right? There's lots of conferences that are like business development conferences or meant to sort of generate memes and headlines. This is a conference designed to actually generate policy action, right? To move the ball down the field. So I think this is the event to come to in DC. Again, I'm just sort of shilling it, but this is going to be a big one.
Just to, I think, situate this for folks a little bit more. I think the most important to me part of what Matt just said is the sort of how distilled this is going to be around the executive branch in particular, right? So lots of Bitcoin conferences, you're used to having Bitcoin luminaries and macro folks and podcasters on stage. We are keeping that to an absolute minimum at our conference. There will be some of those, but that's not really the focus. And increasingly at big Bitcoin and crypto conferences, you'll see members of the legislative branch. For people who are not sort of fully read up on their civics, the United States federal government has three branches. There's the judicial branch, which is not going to speak really at any conference. It's very, very rare federal judges will speak about anything. We're not close to the point where they're speaking in public about Bitcoin. We're just trying to make sure they understand it at this point, to be frank. What people are used to hearing is the legislative branch, that's Congress, so the House of Representatives and the Senate. They make laws. Their primary interaction with Bitcoin and with crypto is pandering, or on the Elizabeth Warren side, attacking it. But it's very rhetorical, right? These are people who want to please their constituents. They want to raise money. And so mostly what they do is they say nice things about Bitcoin. Some of them understand it better than others. At our summit, we're going to have the people that like really understand and care about this, as opposed to the people that are just rhetorically pro Bitcoin. And then occasionally you get actual legislation that matters in a positive or negative direction for Bitcoin. So the negative direction would be something like Elizabeth Warren's DAMLA bill, which bans sort of the direct use of Bitcoin by labeling everyone as a money transmitter. In the positive side, you have something like the Bitcoin Act, which would fund a federal SBR. You have the Genius Act on stablecoins that's in front of the Senate, and then the market structure bill that's coming later, and then the BRCA, which I think we're going to talk about later today. But that's really sort of sporadic. When it happens, it's a big deal. But they are not the people day in and day out doing policy that is relevant to Bitcoin. And then you have the executive branch, which is right now the most interesting. We, for the first time ever, have a pro-Bitcoin presidential administration where most of the what's in DC called the principal level are personally bought in and aligned on Bitcoin and are starting to like really understand it granularly, in no small part thanks to Matt's work in particular on Bitcoin and geopolitics and what that can mean for the United States. But what you're going to see at our summit that you have not seen at other Bitcoin conferences, even that are heavy on politics, are the people that actually implement US policy, the people that are subject matter experts in their domain, whether that domain is foreign policy, whether that domain is regulation of the markets like the SEC, whether that domain is the intelligence community and really thinking strategic thoughts about what's the relationship between the United States and rising powers in a world where we're moving away from just pure dollar hegemony. And the people who are speaking at our summit, who are in the executive branch, they don't run for office. They're not there to pander to us. They're not there to pander to crypto voters. They don't have voters. They're there to both understand what Bitcoin can offer the United States government in terms of a lever to achieve U.S. aims. They're there to share their perspective on how we as a Bitcoin community should think about their policy work from the government. And I think this is the most important sort of story of Bitcoin policy that isn't being told. And I don't think, well, there have been some folks on this list, especially from the White House, who have made some appearances. I don't think there's been any event that has close to the depth of what the actual policymakers, the people that execute the power of the federal government, what they think about Bitcoin, and getting them in the room with folks in industry and folks who really deeply understand the technology and the sort of game theory around its implications.
The last point I'll add to that, which is excellent, is there's gonna be a lot more people in the audience that are almost as important as the people on stage. And unlike other conferences where there's a lot of people sort of clamoring to get stage time because they want to get attention, they want to pitch their product, they want to, get their name out there. The folks we're inviting to this are, senior bureaucrats, right? Assistant secretaries of blank, right? Deputy undersecretaries of blank, directors of various offices, folks of significant administrative and bureaucratic responsibility, most of whom, whose names are, like you barely Google them, right? Show up on, some org chart. But those people matter, especially now in an era where the administration at the top has said, we want to be pro Bitcoin, and everyone else in the apparatus is, okay, well, what does that mean? Right? Like, what does that mean for me? What do I do? Do I write a memo? Do I issue an instruction? Do I pull back a regulation? And there's a lot of kind of, inertia in the system. And that system was set, right, in the last 4 years in a particular direction. And just because the president signs a piece of paper doesn't mean, the whole ship of state like immediately turns. And so this sort of event is meant to kind of move the whole ship of state in a different direction here. And so it's almost more important to have the folks in the room listening and meeting with each other, meeting with professionals from inside and outside the industry that take the topic of Bitcoin and its intersection with, national security, with energy, with AI, with human rights, like very seriously. This isn't, this was a theoretical conversation that we sort of tried to catalyze in earlier Bitcoin policy summits. It was very, I'd say, notional. We were pointing at certain examples, but it was trying to just get people to pay attention, to be honest. Now they're very much paying attention, and they want like concrete ideas, and they want to work with people that are actually doing things that are relevant in that space. So it's hard to kind of overestimate like the significance of getting the sort of the machinery to engage with Bitcoin in this way, in a pro Bitcoin way, in a way that aligns with our ethos and our values, and tries to, establish a consistency over time that doesn't just wax and wane with the political cycle.
Yeah, that's great. I think, the other key thing to highlight here, and I assume most people who are listening to this are familiar with the annual Bitcoin conference, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happened in Vegas this past week. That I think, the key difference here between Vegas and the Bitcoin Policy Summit was, there was plenty of politicians in Vegas. There were plenty of people talking about how they're looking at Bitcoin, folks from, executive and legislative. But I think the key sort of difference here, as we're 3 weeks out, is that, this is where the sort of policy gets charted looking forward, right? Like, I think a lot of what we heard last week was, hey, it's been however many months, like 5 months since the new administration took over. XYZ things have happened. We're following through on our promises. This is the first time that DC has been sort of decisively pro Bitcoin. What we're looking forward to at the end of June here is what happens after that, because a lot of work has been done, but there's also a lot of work yet to be done. And I think the three of us are all extremely bullish on what we might hear in DC, especially when those folks get up on stage and they know who's in the audience. They know that there are staffers from the executive agencies, from senators and congressmen offices. They want to send a signal to those folks of hey, this is how the administration looks at this. This is how our agency looks at this, trying to kind of move everybody in the same direction. So really looking forward to that. But do want to touch back here on what we heard in Vegas. Obviously, the event was headlined by Vice President J.D. Vance. And there was a little Easter egg in his speech. So Pines, can you just sort of, I think probably most people have seen this on Twitter, hopefully, but what happened during the speech, and what does that kind of indicate for Bitcoin policy?
Yes, it was kind of a bit of an out-of-body experience because I was on the live desk, which, first of all, by the way, shout out to David Bailey and the Bitcoin conference crew for putting on, a remarkable event, right? Those are extremely complicated things to pull off. Everyone likes to shout from the peanut gallery, right, and criticize. But just, it was just a very well-run event. There's obviously things that you could improve, but just the fact that they were able to feature us, right? BPI was like extremely integrated into the program. We had and that's kind of been like the, again, like a thing we've been building to, right? Like assembling the deepest bench of policy experts, folks that have measured, credible opinions and analysis on a wide range of different topics in Bitcoin, and be able to kind of like, bring the whole, bench, right, and field them into the, into the play and have them essentially on stage driving the conversation, I think is exactly kind of what BPI was for. And the fact that, they provided a venue for us to kind of feature our expertise was very welcomed, and it was a privilege there. So we were on the live desk, Zack and I, as Vice President Vance gave his remarks. And I'd say my initial impression was, I was listening to it, was kind of like, meh, like it was a lot of kind of like written by committee, very like generic, kind of vague statements, kind of a bit of patting on the back and somewhat broad stuff about blockchain for healthcare. And I think he was losing the room a bit. It wasn't. It was a bit of a kind of a tepid speech to a Bitcoin audience. But he's a smart guy, and he's got those politician instincts. And so I think at the end of his prepared remarks, he sort of took the opportunity to kind of to riff extemporaneously and kind of give his thoughts, right? Give his unfiltered, top of the dome opinions on Bitcoin and what he cares about. And that to me was a very different speech, right? Like almost like two speeches in one, right? And that was the one that I think was the most interesting, because he was kind of being very frank with the audience, essentially saying what his view of the political valence of Bitcoin is. I may disagree with it, but it's like important to know that his position is that the perception apparently is that AI is like a more left-leaning sorts of technology domain, and Bitcoin is a more right-leaning technology domain. I think we have our disagreements on that framing, but that's an important, categorization. And the second most important thing that he sort of drew attention to was this question of Bitcoin's strategic significance in the context of a technology race with China and accelerating digital disruptions. And Bitcoin is both it's both a geopolitical, emerging monetary asset, but it's also a network. It's a network that's embedded into systems of technology that are rapidly changing. And I think he was articulating a view of uncertainty about how to precisely like link together all these very complicated sort of threads, right? They're trying to make a lot of changes to the global system. They're trying to win a strategic competition with China. It was a call to action. Like this has to be two-way conversation. Can the Bitcoin community come to the table with serious and justified analysis that paints Bitcoin in the strategic light that it deserves, and articulates a view that the administration can adopt that integrates Bitcoin into their larger strategic plans and objectives. And it was very much a surprise to hear him shout out Bitcoin Policy Institute for doing exactly that type of work, and essentially a call for us to do more of that type of work. And, that's what we do. So it was wonderful to hear the vice president essentially specifically name check us and our work on the subject and ask for more, right? The purpose of a think tank is to produce white papers and, spew that you hope policymakers will listen to and will use to inform their decisions. And so that was the most validating moment, at least I've had in my kind of Bitcoin kind of think boy career, was to have the vice president essentially recognize the value of what BPI is doing. And say that it's actually of strategic significance to how the administration is going to view Bitcoin. And so we are, certainly factoring that into how we plan the summit, but more importantly, how we double down on the research and analysis and engagement with the administration, right? Again, this is not supporting the administration's, party. It's about supporting the governance of our political institutions that have the authority to do good or bad things from our perspective relative to Bitcoin. And I think now we have this limited window of opportunity to kind of decisively shift in the most positive direction possible. And so I think we should capitalize on that, with alacrity.
Satoshi released Bitcoin. The world was forever changed. No one realized it.
This is the once-in-a-century opportunity.
And this is just the beginning.
Bitcoin is like digital gold.
So I view Bitcoin in line with the next evolution of humans engineering a better world.
I think the story of the past few years is Bitcoin going from a niche interest into a respectable global macro asset.
Bitcoin Policy Institute has become a thought leader.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of sort of moving quickly here, we heard news out of Moscow, I guess late last week, that Russia's largest bank will now be issuing something similar to what we're calling a BitBond. There was some BitBond talk also at the conference. So Pines, what's going on there? And I think I do also want to hit on what Mayor Adams talked about. I know that there was a series of articles that came out after that, talking about how the comptroller basically, was like, hey, I'm not going to let, New York's bondholders basically, be at the whims of these volatile cryptocurrencies. But what was the significance of what Mayor Adams announced, regardless of how the actual politics of that are going to play out?
Yeah, I guess I'll zoom out and say that there's ideas in the water now, right? And so different institutions are picking up these ideas, and it starts small. It starts with sort of individual, say a Russian bank that decides because they want to provide some subset of their investors access to Bitcoin in a way that's controlled, right? They don't want to have them access to actual physical Bitcoin. They're going to create kind of a bond structure that's sort of indexed to Bitcoin, and that has a certain kind of payoff profile that's maybe like a BitBond. It's not quite like a BitBond. There's no actual like physical Bitcoin being paid out. It's kind of just a reference mark. But it's like an indication. It's a direction of travel, right? That's now being permitted by the authorities. Russia has done, a few kind of very halting moves and kind of trying to integrate Bitcoin into some of their financial markets, but it's been very much like a controlled, regulated process and very much only for like accredited investors. And certainly they're not going to allow people to like, physically hold large quantities of Bitcoin or sort of transact without going through state institutions. So that was a very interesting test case. And it certainly is something that is, a hint of where the strategic, lines are being redrawn around Bitcoin's relevance to the global system. So I think folks in the White House should pay very close attention to what banks like Sberbank are doing here, right? It's a first step, but it's a clue for where they might be going. And then the mayor of New York announcing BitBonds, right? Again, kind of like an idea that BPI kind of helped kind of amplify, had been introduced in the Bitcoin space for a while now. But we worked with Andrew Hohns to kind of solidify a certain policy prescription of how that could be implemented. And we wrote a white paper, and Andrew Hohns gave a great presentation at our last event. And so now that this idea is out there, and aspiring politicians that want to get attention from the Bitcoin community, it's like, okay, this is like a matchup between an interesting policy idea that's kind of on the cutting edge and an aspiring politician who wants to attract the attention and support of Bitcoiners. And so this is kind of the natural dynamic I think we're seeing play out here, where the New York City, general obligation bond like is a vehicle potentially to do a kind of a BitBond like example. Now, how that gets implemented over the political calendar inside New York City, they're going through a mayoral race, right? So all this is ultimately going to be downstream of the results of that election. But now that this is sort of the doors open, other mayors in other cities are now going to be asking the question, well, does this make sense to me? Should I ask my senior finance team to like explore this? And then you start this ball rolling.
Yeah, Zach, a question to you here. We've been working on a state legislation toolkit, and one sort of major tenet of that is the BitBonds proposal. Do you see this being of sort of increasing interest to state governments, municipalities? What are sort of the selling points for folks like that? And you can touch back on what Mayor Adams talked about as well. If
it's all right. I think I want to touch back on just Vegas in general for a minute, because I think we collectively had a sort of unique experience there that we can share. I think every year, the Bitcoin conference in particular, right? It's this sort of massive thing. There are sort of two things that go on. There is the public facing part of the conference, which is the speeches and the sponsors and the sort of hoopla and the big parties. And that's one very important thing to pay attention to, because it gives you a theme of where we are in the Bitcoin story. And my thesis on this is that every cycle thinks it's about the thing that the next cycle is about. So, if you remember back to 2021, everyone used the term institutional adoption all the time, and the institutions are coming. And the early institutions were, right? That was Michael Saylor, that was Tesla. But those were mostly symbolic and really sort of setting the conceptual groundwork for what really happened this cycle, where undeniably, if you watched the speeches and you paid attention to the themes of this summit, it's the institutions are here, right? The institutions, everything from sovereign wealth funds to public companies to Bitcoin treasury plays to you name it, the institutions were there and they were walking around the whale room and they were giving speeches, and the major investment banks are in, and Wall Street likes it. And in this cycle, we talk a lot about nation state adoption and game theory, and we are seeing the early innings of that. We're seeing the conceptual groundwork for that being laid with the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve executive order and some public investment by foreign governments, and hopefully some investment by the United States government. But it's the early innings in what I would guess will be fully in bloom by the 2028 cycle. And so there was just a really interesting energy sort of on the floor of the conference this year in the speeches of the big money is here, TradFi is here, the nation states are coming somewhere around the corner, and Bitcoin is playing out on this much larger stage than it ever has before. Okay, so that's the sort of like main face of the conference. But there's always, and I think particularly this year, was sort of the behind the scenes inside game at the Bitcoin conference as well. And I remember I took this class in college on architecture where they compared British and French country houses. And British country houses are all about sort of recreating nature in the garden and comfort. And French country houses are all about like imposing strict order on nature. They have these axial gardens. But one detail about French country houses, and I'll tell you the relevance in a second, that always struck me, was the interior of like the French estates would be arranged from bigger to smaller rooms. And if you were invited to visit one of these houses, you knew how important you were because you would be invited further into the interior in smaller rooms. And not something he talks about a lot, but this is something that like David Bailey is really, really good at, and arranging these sort of rooms within rooms. And there is absolutely an inside game at these conferences of people meeting each other and making policy. And while the speeches and the main tenor of the conference is oftentimes backward looking, it's a celebration of here's where we are. From the politicians, it's look what we've done for you over the past few months. These sort of inside rooms, right? These smaller events, some of them official, some of them non-official, there are conversations that are happening that will shape the future of Bitcoin. And the last part of Vance's speech, which sounded a lot like this podcast, right? In that he was talking about what Bitcoin means in an AGI world. You know, Bitcoin could be a counterbalance and we shouldn't just treat it as a left-right partisan thing, where he's talking about the geopolitical significance of Bitcoin with the rise of China. Some of that, I'm not talking out of school because it like came from literally a room within a room conversation that Pines had with a couple of folks, including the vice president of staff, and like that stuff is all really cool. And just to go back to our summit, what I'm really excited about at the end of this month in DC is we are going to have an entire conference that I think will feel like the rooms within rooms in Vegas. But I think one thing for listeners today is like what absolutely you can learn a lot by what you see from the live stream from the Vegas conference. But you have to imagine all of those people who are speaking are also there speaking with each other. And there are all sorts of different side conversations where when you get the industry leaders, the government officials from different branches of government, the analysts of all different types together, the alchemy that comes out of that in terms of like where this is all headed gets baked in like a really exciting way. So one of the announcements we got is about BitBonds from the mayor of New York. And I think there's some interesting inside baseball there that probably we can't talk about on this podcast. But it raises the question of, okay, BitBonds, who are they good for? And I think the truth is we don't know the answer for that yet, right? Really zooming out, what we know about Bitcoin so far and what's uncontroversial now is that Bitcoin is incredible collateral. Then the next question is, what do you do with it? And people are trying to do all sorts of stuff with it. Michael Saylor is using it in a certain way. The other treasury companies are using it in other ways. Nation states are trying to use it as a reserve asset. But then there are all sorts of interesting ways that people are trying to use Bitcoin as in conjunction with other types of collateral or assets based on its unique properties and liquidity profile. But one of these subcategories is integrating Bitcoin into fiat debt, right? The whole sort of larger concept of a BitBond. And for the United States and the federal level, before we get to the states, I mean, this is a really interesting way to sort of seed the strategic Bitcoin reserve and create different types of demand for US debt. But maybe the most interesting version of this is at the state and local level, where you can do tax-free municipal bonds. And if it's done well, definitely lawyers will argue back and forth about this, but if you can create tax-free upside exposure to Bitcoin, which is sort of the heart of this from a policy perspective, you can create an enormous amount of demand for these bonds, right? An enormous amount, which levels the playing field a little bit between states and municipalities on the one end and the federal government on the other. The US federal government gets to issue T-bills, right? That's the risk-free asset. There's a huge amount of demand for that. There's a huge amount of liquidity, and it allows us to run incredible deficits. And it allows people to get wacky theories like MMT, that it just doesn't matter, like money is this abstract principle we don't need to treat seriously, right? That's how powerful the T-bill is. When you now introduce a state and local instrument that it doesn't have the same power as the sort of full faith and credit of the United States government, which gets to print the world reserve asset, but it does give you perhaps tax-free exposure to Bitcoin. What power does that give, especially the first states and municipalities to embrace this, right? That don't have to compete with other similar offerings and get to experiment with, what versions of this, what sort of interest rates, what reserve requirements, how much Bitcoin exposure, et cetera, et cetera. They are going to be able to pull from the future and invest in themselves in an incredibly potent way. So to preview one of the things we're going to be releasing over the next couple of weeks, we have this state toolkit. There's a lengthy section in it setting out model language for how states can adopt BitBonds if they so choose. But I think the answer is specifically because of the Bitcoin upside piece, specifically because of the special treatment that like muni bonds get. This is a unbelievably powerful opportunity specifically for state and local governments that can't print money and that can't borrow ad infinitum because they control the world reserve currency.
Man, when Zack goes on his soliloquy, it's just sit back and listen. I do want to foot stomp one point that he brought up and kind of the vibe, right, and the kind of the different levels of conversation at the Vegas conference. And Bitcoin is a weird thing, right? Like a Bitcoin conference, you're like, oh, it's an industry conference. It must be like people coming with their to try to get business deals and sell products. And there's like a lot of that. That's like what the conference, most of the physical space is like dedicated to, people going up on stage and sort of spewing, and then people having booths to like sell stuff, and then people having parties to have fun. But Bitcoin is kind of this, it's not like a normal industry, right? It's this sort of fast changing global monetary movement in a sense, right? It's kind of like this mind virus that is spread person to person. And it has the same sort of dynamics on, the average pleb as it does on like on the average national leader, right? And they're all trying to understand what's happening here. There's no master planner. There's no I think there's rooms within rooms, but at least my perspective, there's no one with like the master plan. There's no like grand design. It's like fractal chaos and sort of self-organized, kind of mutual kind of convergence at every scale. And so there's a lot of contingency involved in this. And there's also, I think, a lot of, individual personalities associated with kind of these like hinge moments, right? Of like, where do things move and how do people engage and what do they think about Bitcoin? Like, I think, there's been a lot written about the kind of politics of Bitcoin, right? The politics of Bitcoiners engaging in the political system. That's certainly been like a major story since 2024. I think it obviously had a material effect on the results of the election. And I think that has then dominated, I think, a lot of the kind of the resulting kind of digestion of Bitcoin by like, I want to call it like the latently hostile kind of media apparatus, right? That's like trying to understand this new phenomena and like understand its political valence. But there's also, I think, like that gets a lot of the attention, right? Certainly like, oh, it's like the headline of my Wall Street Journal is like, Bitcoin goes all in on MAGA, right? Well, one, like Bitcoin is not like a corporation. Bitcoin doesn't have like a single, board of directors that like decides a political, orientation. There's like individual Bitcoiners who have decided to engage in a certain way in the political process with some success. But there's a lot of Bitcoiners that disagree with that, right? Sort of vehemently. And that's the beauty of Bitcoin, right? There is no like, red or blue or pink or whatever flag on Bitcoin. There's just orange, right? But it is anchoring in now in these different parts of the political economy. Some of them is visible, right, which is politicians giving speeches. But I think what I'm most interested in now in our summit in later in June is how does it align with folks that view their strategic orientation to responsibilities for the country itself, right? And there are politicians, right, that oftentimes straddle the difference between just kind of raising money and actually trying to like solve hard problems for America, right? And actually like do good things, quote unquote, right? Again, like people's motives are always mixed, right? There's never such thing as like a pure-hearted politician here. But you have to approach the person, where they are. And Bitcoin is a complicated thing. And Bitcoin is something that Bitcoiners think about all the time. It's like, we have a whole think tank. Our jobs are to write and think about Bitcoin. The vast majority of people that we're talking to in politics think about Bitcoin like 1% of their life, right? At most. And so how they engage with Bitcoin in that 1% of their life, right? Like matters a lot. If it's like, oh, a bunch of rich people want to throw money at me and have me say positive things about Bitcoin, that's going to color their impression about the like actual strategic significance of Bitcoin. And so, I think there's been a lot of political success in engaging in the system, not necessarily normatively, just like objectively, it's been successful. It's kind of thin, right? It's like, just because you get like a political ally because of campaign contributions, like those are fair weather friends, right? Those people come and go. Do they actually get it? Do they understand it? Do they care about it? Does it deeply align with their sense of what they want to accomplish in the world and the instruments of power that they want to wield? And I say, like, BPI's whole mission is to actually, argue analytically, not like politically. Just say Bitcoin is a very significant thing, and it's on this inflection point. And there's lots of inflection points coming. We're in this era of inflection points, and this is just one among many that are going to like land on the doorstep of these policymakers potentially soon, right? Like when a lot of focus is on AI. We've talked about this in podcasts, like. The fact that is there a reasonable forecast that say that we could have AGI in say 2 to 4 years? That's in the time horizon of like a current serving politician, right? They can't just kick that to some future, politician that's gonna, or some, executive that's gonna hold that job. It's now like in their near horizon, right? They have to care about it. It's gonna matter to them. And I think Bitcoin, it's like there's that sort of subtle shift, right? When it's like a far future hypothetical thing that Bitcoin could become geopolitically important. It's like, oh, that's a curious like bar conversation, but it's not relevant to my immediate job, right? I think now we can credibly make the case, just like the AI community has credibly made the case, that Bitcoin does matter and will matter very soon to a lot of these strategic questions. That Bitcoin tends to do Bitcoin things. Going from a $2 trillion asset to a $20 trillion asset and reach parity with gold is not an implausible scenario in the time horizon of current politicians in the next 2 to 4 years. That seems like a crazy scenario for most people, but it's not like an implausible scenario to have that type of radical price movement if, as Zack says, we are kind of setting the conceptual predicate now for Bitcoin to become a geopolitical asset. What that means is that sovereign pools of capital will hold material allocations to Bitcoin. And that, doesn't require a whole lot of actual capital coming into Bitcoin to move it, trillions of dollars. And that has strategic significance. And so like, we get kind of in the weeds on a lot of things, but like that single move, right, in the minds of politicians has all these cascading, effects. And to maybe tee up the next conversation, it then magnifies in importance all of these other policy issues, right? Like, the protections for self-custody, the protections for open source, software developers. These are kind of niche issues, quote unquote, right, in kind of the digital assets ecosystem. But if Bitcoin does become like a global digital gold, then these will have massive implications to like which direction do we choose, right? There's gonna be a path dependency here, and I think we should take a close look and think very hard about what we're prioritizing in the policy process, right? What will matter in 2 or 3, 4 years? Looking back on it now, like, well, stable coins are important. Market structure is important. Getting the United States on the right side of this, like, once in a generation, once maybe in a millennia, like monetization event of a new digital asset, maybe more important, right? Making sure that like the ethos of Bitcoin and the view that we have of the relationship between the state and society and individuals when it comes to open source software and peer-to-peer transactions is like preserved, if not amplified, along that trajectory. And so the stakes are very high, and the time pressure is pretty acute.
And hence why we're doing the Bitcoin Policy Hour that JD Vance has been listening to, right? Maybe. Okay.
And why we need the BRCA.
Right.
Exactly.
So let's dig into the BRCA, the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, that was, I think, introduced or reintroduced by Whip Tom Emmer and Richie Torres a couple weeks ago. Zach, what is the BRCA, and why have we sort of put our weight behind this?
Yeah, there are quite a few policy areas we care about at BPI. We recently released what we've been calling our policy manifesto, but it's our 2025 policy framework, which is really sort of a comprehensive list of what we care about in Bitcoin policy, why, and what our specific suggestions are. And folks should definitely read that for sort of the overview. And we're going to talk about all of that stuff at our summit. There are two issues in particular we've really been focused on, though, right? There are two sort of first among equals. And both of them relate to the point that Matt was just making about, okay, if you believe, as most people listening to this podcast will believe, that this is once in a millennia might be generous, right? It's been, I don't know, several millennia since gold was monetized, since we got that kind of new base asset. Maybe you count fiat, who knows? But this is a really, really rare moment in time where Bitcoin is monetizing. It's really important that we get this right. And the raison d'etre of BPI in particular is that we all happen to be born and live in the maybe waning, maybe not global superpower, which is going to play an outsized role in what happens when Bitcoin becomes an important geopolitical issue. And we can get this right vis-a-vis Bitcoin. We can get this right vis-a-vis America, or we can get it wrong. And when I think about the two most important things that are really important to get right and not wrong, one is, what orientation does the United States have to Bitcoin, the asset? And so that's why we've been so focused on the strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's not, as our critics will say, just about pumping our bags. Our bags are doing great. That's not the problem. Is the United States going to get this right in a way that preserves the value of the dollar and preserves our purchasing power and avoids sort of global economic catastrophe with some sort of sovereign debt issue? The other issue, and this one's much scarier, and the one that I personally have been super focused on, is there is a really novel aspect of Bitcoin, the technology, which is that it's peer-to-peer. And our laws were, by and large, all written, the important laws, before such a thing existed, before you could do any kind of literal peer-to-peer electronic payment. And so we have an old set of laws that are facing this new technology, and there are basically two options here. We could either change the laws and regulations to deal with the fact that this new technology exists, which is what the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act does, or we could use the old laws, sort of twist them into a pretzel, and use it to try and fight our hardest a losing battle against the existence of this new technology, which is what's happening in the Samurai Wallet and Tornado Cash cases, right? Where, and specifically the issue here is, with peer-to-peer technology, there's no financial intermediary, and our laws presume that there is a financial intermediary that should be regulated. And so either we need to say in law what those intermediaries are in the new world and where they exist. And the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act is a fix to that problem. It draws this important line between custodial and non-custodial technology. And it says, in the context of digital assets, including Bitcoin, a money service business, which is our word. Other countries talk about virtual asset service providers or different concepts, but our regulated financial institutions are any kind of service or business that custody or controls user funds, right? That you entrust with your Bitcoin, that are able to control your Bitcoin. And then everything short of that is software. And that's a very reasonable place to draw the line and a really important step forward. It doesn't fix everything. There are interesting questions that remain about federated networks in particular that, like, I would love to see sort of fleshed out a little bit, but this is a really important step in the right direction. The other approach, to put a finer point on it, is what's happening in Samurai and Tornado Cash, which is to say, we don't really see this financial intermediary, but this technology is kind of doing, this code is kind of doing what those institutions would do. And so let's just treat the people that create that code. And by the way, the more I've thought about this is not an issue that's going to be totally unique to Bitcoin and crypto. One of my law school roommates has actually written a lot about sort of how we're going to regulate AI and self-driving cars and where the liability should sit there. And when you have code doing things that people used to do, right, that's sort of the broader lens on this problem, and society does need to face that. But I'm not an expert in that stuff. I am sort of now an expert in this issue specific to Bitcoin and crypto, and it just will be a disaster to go the wrong way on that question and try and hold software developers accountable. It'll be a disaster in terms of the U.S. Constitution. It'll undermine the First Amendment. It'll be a disaster in that it's an attempted ban that's not going to work on Bitcoin and crypto. If you hear that we're going to regulate non-custodial tech as money transmitters, you should just reorient that in your head to, oh, I'm trying to ban Bitcoin because I don't understand it or don't like it. That's what that means. And so, in the Samurai Wallet case, maybe we can talk about a little bit of the recent details, but that's not going great. But even if we win that case, we've averted disaster, but that's a temporary fix. The door is still open specifically to people that do not like Bitcoin and want to ban it, to use this moment of ambiguity, this limited moment in time before the law figures out what to do with non-custodial peer-to-peer technology. They can use that as a weapon against us. And the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, which it's amazing that this was again reintroduced on a bipartisan basis, including with Richie Torres, who's a Democratic rock star from New York City. We love Richie Torres. This is a good, smart, non-political, enduring fix to the problem that will last even if the Trump folks lose the next time around and we have a Democratic president. The BRCA will be the shield that we will really need in that moment. And so, aside from the SBR, which is really about us pressing our advantage and getting into the best position we can, this is the other issue that is incredibly time sensitive and where I feel like we at BPI are uniquely in a position to prosecute this case, and we're playing for all the marbles.
Yeah, the one point I would add to that is it's not just a values question and not just a question about whether Americans will be able to participate in these innovations, but like where those will take place, right? I think Matt Corallo, who's been leading the charge on this stuff, has pointed out, right? Like developers are not going to take legal risk here. And so, it's very plausible that you would see all the innovation that's happening on layer 2s with Lightning Network move offshore and Americans get blocked from accessing it. And so you could have a situation where there's like a strategic contradiction here between the United States saying we want to be the crypto capital of the world. We want to be the America's Bitcoin superpower. And yet, like the fundamental premise of the technology, because of, arcane interpretations of, pre-digital laws, push all of that offshore. And, is a massive W for the anti-crypto army, right? And so I think there's a lot of folks in Bitcoin that think we won, quote unquote, right? Like number go up, government's going to pump our bags. Like, what are you doing talking about this sort of acronym soup of legislation and why it's important? Like this is really, really critical. Like you could wake up in a world, even in Trump administration, where these things that Bitcoiners are, very, very excited about, all of a sudden you can't use, right? And that's in a favorable, political environment, let alone in an unfavorable political environment where, America likes to go overseas and exert its sort of extraterritorial jurisdiction, and try to even shut down those sorts of services around the world, right? And get kind of, the kind of G20. There's a whole, the whole FATF kind of virtual asset service provider is meant to kind of, was oriented in a certain way over the course of my administration to kind of choke out these sorts of tools around the world and really lock down a kind of very centralized digital ecosystem. And so there's still a very, very significant fight here. And I would just say that the political economy, unfortunately, for the digital assets, policies, world inside DC is like stablecoins are like, we're seen as relatively simple, clean, like get those done, even though there were some issues there. They're close to being done, apparently, although, it's not a done deal. And then there's just kind of like the shibboleth that market structure is next, because everyone has invested the last 3 or 4 years in trying to like write rules for defining what like a commodity versus a crypto asset security versus a utility token, et cetera is. And that's important, but that really matters mostly to like the Coinbases and the ACCZs of the world, that want to have like, lightweight regulation, sandboxes. They don't want to have to, file this extra paperwork. They want to have, certain disclosures. But for the average user that wants to have the promise of Bitcoin, in particular in layer 2 technologies, those are not prioritized, right? At all, right? If you look at the priorities, stablecoins and market structure, Bitcoin is like a distant third, with maybe the SBR coming down the line. And then only in the last, like, I'd say week or two, has there been kind of like a mini groundswell that we're trying to help reinforce for what we think is like the critical line in the sand here, which is enforcing in law a definition that clearly protects non-custodial tools, right, that are not defined as money service businesses. Like, that matters much more. Like, the priorities in DC are like inverted from like dramatically inverted, right? Like, if you were gonna like, okay, clean sheet of paper, what do we do first? I don't want to say Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act first, then True Bitcoin Reserve, then stablecoins, and then market structure, right? We've got it almost completely backwards. And that's because Bitcoin is a diffuse, leaderless ecosystem, doesn't have an army of lobbyists, doesn't have an army of industry associations. And all those people are great people, right? We work with them. They're really, but they're responsive to their incentives, right? And to their community that they engage with, right? They're industry, representatives. And oftentimes, the bottom line matters much more than like kind of this core technology principle. And it's kind of because there's, Bitcoin solves, it's kind of the height of ironies, right? Bitcoin solved a, computer science problem that was wrapped around a coordination problem, right? Like, how do you have, essentially a decentralized, sort of ledger, right? Where there's no central sort of, counterparty to trust. And it used these very clever tricks of cryptography and game theory, proof of work, et cetera, to sort of engineer distributed consensus. But now we have this environment where, like, that in that system, there's now a coordination problem, right? There's a risk that everyone in the network and everyone in the industry is exposed to, but there's no single like coordination point to try to like motivate action, right? So it all has to be done through podcasts and through Twitter to say, this is important, guys. Like, you should call your congressman. You should say, Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, this is actually a priority. This is why. I guarantee you, most people in Congress have no idea this even exists. And it's thanks to the work of some, real champions to even get this in there. But I think this is a call to action for the Bitcoin community to really pay attention to these sorts of things, and to make their voice heard. And we had like that issue where a few years ago where it was like the late night broker rule, and there was this cause celeb, and everyone got on their phones and called. And, this is kind of like that, right? This is kind of like an issue where you really need to kind of get in the trenches here and say, this is actually a priority. Because otherwise, folks that pay for lobbyists, right, to get their stablecoin, definition sort of regulatory moat carved out, they get the meetings, right? They get the politicians listen, right? And they go, okay, I'm hearing every day people come to my office talking about market structure stablecoins. I haven't heard a single person come to my office talking about, or call my office talking about Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. That's all I need to know about what I should care about, right? And that's just literally how like the calculation game works here. Yeah, BPI obviously is trying to tip the scales, but I'd say we're like 10% of the advocacy engine inside DC at best when it comes to digital assets, and so yeah, we would need all the help we can get.
Yeah, in fact, it's the same issue as the midnight broker rule. It's the same. Yeah, they're the scariest thing about this potential authoritarian creep of getting this problem wrong is that it can go unnoticed for a while. And there are two ways in which it can go unnoticed. One, we can lose the stuff that really matters here, that both makes Bitcoin freedom money, but even the thing that makes Bitcoin valuable as an asset, that it's a credible, neutral commodity. We can lose that while still looking like number is going up based on ETF flows. And those things can be divorced. And then right now, I think the scariest way in which it can go unnoticed is, unlike the fight over the broker rule, where that was through a democratic process, right? It was through the legislative process and the industry was able to make noise. We can get a federal judge. There are two cases that will allow federal judges to basically unilaterally create this rule without any democratic buy-in, which is why we need to be so focused on those cases at the current moment. And just briefly to sort of close the loop on this, we got some news in one of those cases this week. The defense in the Samurai Wallet case filed a few motions. They'd wanted to file a bunch of motions along the way. The judge has been a little bit, I I would say, unfair to them and said, you have to do all your motions at once. And so this was the time they did all their motions at once. So just to keep people up to speed so that these don't go under the radar, defendants filed a motion to dismiss the charges against them, both the money laundering conspiracy charge and the unlicensed transmission charge. Those are great briefs. We posted them on the BPI website. Folks should read them. Banger arguments. Shout out, to Roger Burgum and Michael Krause, who've been doing a great job defending this case, and who we've been funding through the P2P Rights Fund. We learned for the first time in these briefs, the government is going to, like in the Tornado Cash case, drop what's called one of the objects of the money laundering, money transmission charge, which is the direct statement that the Bank Secrecy Act doesn't require custody or control. I think this is due to the really excellent advocacy efforts we've seen across the industry. The folks who've understood this problem have pushed things to the point where we got the Blanche memo, and at least we're not getting the government saying out loud that the Bank Secrecy Act directly applies. Now, however, they are saying a thing that strongly rhymes with that, which is that the defense in this case transmitted funds, which is still unacceptable from a precedent perspective, but we're getting some positive momentum there. Their defendants filed motions to suppress certain evidence in Keone Rodriguez's case. The issue is that he allegedly invoked right to counsel, and the police interrogating him did not listen to that, and they extracted things from him that they should not have under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. In the United States, the Fifth Amendment is due process and gives you a right against self-incrimination. If you've ever heard about someone pleading the Fifth, that's what that's about. The Sixth Amendment is your right to counsel in a criminal case. So that's about whether he invoked that right to counsel. If you've ever heard of Miranda rights, you have a right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. They're alleging that the police violated that right. And so the remedy under the Fourth Amendment is that you are able to suppress evidence, keep evidence that was gained as a result of those illegal actions out of the trial. Similarly, William or Bill Hill filed a different motion to suppress. This one a little bit different. So it's a Fourth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. These are all parts of the Bill of Rights, which are the First Amendments. Fourth Amendment is about unreasonable search and seizure. They said that the search of his electronic devices violated the Fourth Amendment and was illegal in various ways, and trying to suppress that evidence. Bill also filed a motion to separate his trial from Keone's. So they would each have a separate jury trial. The reason for that is so that they can call each other as fact witnesses. One of the issues in this case is going to be their mindset. Did they know they were doing something wrong? Did they intentionally break the law? And there's apparently a bunch of communications between them where they understood the FinCEN rules to be the thing that basically everyone else did, which is what they were doing was legal, and they were compliant with all of the laws and regulations they had to be. And in order to prove that mind state, they need to have each other sort of testify about their conversations, but in a way that doesn't waive each other's right against self-incrimination from the jury. Because if it's in the same trial and one defendant testifies in favor of the other as a fact witness, that opens that defendant up to cross-examination by the government, which normally you have the right not to have happen. So that's if people are seeing the motion to separate trials, that's what's that about. And then there were two other motions that should have just been no-brainers. One is this is a complicated, for the reasons we've been talking about this whole podcast, a complicated legal issue. And normally the judge has what's called a local rule where he only wants briefs to be 25 pages long. The defense counsel asked permission to file a 35-page brief, and the judge said no. It's a little bit mystifying here. And then also, because this is a tricky issue, they asked the right to file 2 amicus briefs. Amicus is Latin. It's short for amicus curiae, or friend of the court, which are people who are not actually lawyers or defendants in the case, but they can file some brief sort of explaining an issue they're expert on to the judge to help the judge understand these issues. Obviously, that would be really helpful in this case. And there were 2 proposed amicus briefs. One was from the Blockchain Association and the DeFi Education Fund, which are both great organizations. And the other was from ourselves and Coin Center, also great organizations. And the judge was like, I don't want to hear it, but maybe at oral argument, you can bring in amicus then. So really hard to understand how a judge in his late 70s understands these technical issues so well that he couldn't use our help. But there you have it.
Yeah, it was definitely disappointing, at least on my end, having been tracking this for a while, to see all of that sort of play out. But, these things are long processes. It's still kind of time for things to maybe turn in another direction, or, more time for us to
pass the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. That's the
There you go. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, cool. We're coming up on the hour here. Anything else you all want to talk about before we wrap up here?
sign up for a ticket. You know, Zach, is there a discount code we can offer the viewers here? June 25th, and a day on the Hill, June 26th. It's gonna be a banger.
BTC Policy Hour 21, and our website is btcpolicysummit.org. So definitely make sure you sign up. I heard that if you comment on Pines's recent tweet, he might give you a free ticket. So maybe go check that out too. But yeah, it's gonna be a great event. And yeah, that's it for this week. We'll see you next week.